back to you. Were going to make a comment?
I was just thinking that what you were saying made me think too of what was actually driving the creation of these things, because I think that we have to understand the ferment of the moment, to understand how people felt there was an immediate need to the message in this case was more important than the form. We kind of look back on that, and hindsight doesn't give us a clear reflection of what the feeling of that moment was. And it's interesting to me, though, that we actually are being able to look at it in the context of this day. Some of this stuff I think makes more sense, and I think look more antique in the 70s, and actually was discredited. Agitprop has been discredited as a bad art form. At the same time, when you have a situation where you can understand where the message, the context needs to is driving the message and encouraging people to try to figure out how they can find ways to express, and this being one of the ways that came out of this ferment of that moment. Yeah. I think it's really, just says so much that's hard to understand when you look in reflection on it.
Yeah, but to go back to what can we do today? I mean, I think that get together, shout.
It reminds me of that half-hour program on CBC of all the TV and film and theater artists who got together to speak about what art had to say about artists. Yeah. And that hadn't happened before.
Or the Department of Culture, which is,
where everybody spoke out and there was an audience there, and there was that same kind of give and take, that same kind of fervent feeling that would happen in that scenario like that. So that's the modern version of it.
Okay, yeah.
This is a much later period, but in the 70s, in the early 70s, the first theater that I was involved in was an agitprop theater called Open Circle Theater. That, because you mentioned that eviction was a common theme, right. And the show that I was aware of was called I'm Handling Pete's Board, and was a response to one of those first early evictions of
the attempts of the people off the island.
Yeah, the people off the island. Right. Now, by that time, they'd been making more sort of sketches, like putting characters into scenes, sort of in a Passeroni kind of way, and linking it together thematically. But it was used for this very purpose, to raise, consciousness about these people on the island were doing these things.
I was wondering if the opportunities for doing this kind of work opened up at all with when Tommy Douglas was having so much political success, because he was a man of very similar ideals.
Yeah, that's a question I can't answer particularly, whether or not, certainly the group that I've been talking about mostly here today, particularly through the early period, was kind of anti-CCF, right? Yeah. So, pretty sectarian. So, pretty anti-CCF, and it's only in the later period that this kind of popular front where people get together. But I must admit that I don't know much about the use of theater in the NDP or the CCF in the early days. Another research project.
I guess one of the things that strike me, I just wanted to come back to one of the tensions that you talked about, Alex, and I think it's an interesting one, is the difference between working class art making as capacity building as part of this kind of project, and encouraging people essentially to become art makers as part of their deeper understanding of the world, and the kind of artisanal art making that professional actors get. And during the same period, you get a kind of a massive growth in the 30s, 40s, 50s of commercial theater, state-funded theater, and other arts and stuff like that. And it seems to me the working class art making has often been reduced as part of that. And so one of the things I always wonder about when we hear about this stuff is, are there ways to revive some of those ideas as a radical project, which is of not only getting great radical art out there, but also of encouraging art making and understanding that popular art making is actually part of the way that people act on the world.
Right, and I mean there are companies in Toronto that do this kind of stuff, right? I mean there's kind of the groups down at things like the Queen Street Mental Health Center. There's a very active arts group there, both theatrical and art, visual art making. Jumblies Theater is another company that does sort of action in the community. Places like, and I mean, I suppose it just grows, right? I mean, it's someplace like Dufferin Grove Park. It becomes this kind of nexus or axis or something where anybody who wants to sort of do something sort of hangs out, and eventually something sticks. So there are these kind of community festivals, like the Cooking Fire Festival, and dusk dances. So some dancers want to dance in the evening in the park, and they somehow manage to get it. They spend years negotiating with the city on how to do that, and then they manage to get it done. you know, and the farmers market and the bread baking, you know, bread baking as the community building activity, right? It sort of it seems to be sort of central, and free skating, right? Free skating and bread baking, and all of a sudden you have an arts community in Dufferin Grove. Sort of very odd kind of thing.
Just to add, I would say the closest thing that I can think of that's going on to what we presented today would be the wrecking ball.
Right. So volcano.
Actually, it's bigger than volcano. I think possibly for some of the reasons that we talked about, because it can't be tied to a charitable organization because it's obviously political. Right. So it's a bunch of artists, but they're all very well respected, decorated artists, basically, who get together and they pick 2 or 3 playwrights each time, and they have 1 week to write a play based on current political events and stage it, and it's put on. It happens about 4 or 5 times a year, usually at a different theater each time, and it's very successful. It almost always sells out.
No, you can't get a seat now for that one. But that's not quite that. I mean, that's interesting because that's sort of in that sort of professionalized sort of sensibility, right? It's in a theater, you go, you watch it, and that kind of thing. And as you say, they're all very active professional artists who are going off to Stratford, or going back to Shaw, and this sort of stuff after they've done their thing. Whereas there's something, it seems more elusive and more, well, not more interesting, but difficult, this kind of community moment, right? And it does seem to me, one hates to say it, but obviously there's an issue, but there's also a personality. Someone's got to do it. Someone's got to jump into the center and actually sort of be the galvanizing force, like Brecht, right? In his company, you know, sort of this left-leaning company, and it's extremely centric. And he has all the power.
So thinking about the transposition of agitprop today, it seems that one of the fundamental differences that we face now compared to the moment when this was happening was that in the early 1930s it seemed that there was already a constituted audience that could say we, and the agitprop was meant to galvanize the audience, but nevertheless consume it. And I'm wondering, to the extent that that's no longer the case, how agitprop intersects with it. And if it doesn't, then would it be more useful to be using strategies like a theater of rehearsal rather than agitprop right away?
Well, I mean, I think that's really interesting because I think that, like, for me, when I see sort of events that have had sort of success about that, around this kind of thing, the anti-war movement, obviously, in the 60s and 70s had a strong agitprop sensibility. There was never a good demonstration that didn't have something theatrical or performative going on. You had to have a few big puppets, and that was, all that kind of stuff, and it was sort of really, really strong. And that had a constituted audience, right? The anti-war people were going to be there. The gay rights, situation in Toronto in the late 70s and early 80s was, they were, when they were demonstrating, they were strong and they were performative, right? So that sort of sense of, that sensibility does seem to come with the issue and the constituted audience. It's true, you got to find them. So environmentalists, they ride around the city, right? I mean, there's the bike rides and those kinds of things. So there are lots of sort of smaller social interventions, if you will, but I don't know whether or not we can say that there's been a galvanized movement where we can, certainly, I mean, it still shocks me when you say that there's 1,500 people in Toronto would have been, a tenth the size it is now. Thinking about it that way, it's just 1,500 people in a theater to see, workers in the room. What's that?
They filled Maple Leaf Gardens up to 5
Yeah, 15,000 people sort of celebrating the release of the Communist Party of Canada's leader.
I think it's been an interesting piece about looking back at that period of time, just the level of class consciousness inside of society, which was much higher. People had a sense of classes and how they operated, and certainly also, in some ways, a critique of capitalism. And I do think that's something that we lost. We lost it because of the attacks, particularly, especially in North America and the U.S. during the 50s and the McCarthy era. Of course, that was happening here as well. And I think we're just now seeing a return to class politics in a way that is more generalized, that people are starting to differentiate themselves from other people. And nationalism doesn't have the same pull that it has had at other periods. And so I think it's hopeful, and I do think that it does mean that artists are going to have to figure out how to speak. They obviously cannot speak with the language of the 30s, although I think we can access that to give us inspiration for now. But I do think we have to do it. And I also think maybe it's a challenge for us if we feel we do have a level of class consciousness to bring that back in, because we're going to need that. If we're going to fight, we have to understand who we're fighting against.